Hello, and welcome to SpyHards podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, and Scott, let's drink the wine and discuss the harvest.
Yes, let's grab a glass and discuss some secret equations on a chalkboard, perhaps, as well. And of course, if you're joining us here for the first time, we have over 3 years of spy movie reviews and interviews to dive into. So make sure you hit subscribe to keep up to date with the Spy Jinx. And if you enjoy this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. But Cam, I think it's about time we brought in a guest.
I think so.
Indeed. Here to teach us that secret formula to spy podcasting. He's a historian and a curator of the world-renowned International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and the host of the SpyCast podcast. It's Dr. Andrew Hammond. Hello, sir. How are you?
It's great to be here. I'm doing well, thanks.
It's very often we have people that are smarter than us, but it's not often we have people that have a doctorate to prove that they're smarter than us. So I appreciate you being here to really class up the joint.
Wait until we've finished the podcast before you raise the bar too high.
And I think before we get to mentioning the film and getting into all that jazz, let's get to know you a wee bit better. I mentioned the Spy Museum, I mentioned SpyCast, but taking it back a little bit, you've got a doctorate, but what prompted you to want to be involved with sort of spies, whether it be in film, in TV, in history, because you've got all these things going on with the SpyCast podcast as well. Sort of where's that interest come from for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it comes from two places. I think one is, like a lot of kids, I had a childhood fascination with espionage, with spying. So I remember, I used to practically live in our local neighborhood library.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember getting this one book on spying, and it gave you some like tradecraft. One of them was hollowing out a book and using it as a secret compartment. So I remember getting a copy of Peter Benchley's book Jaws and cutting out some of the inside of it, and then it was on my shelf. And there was some kind of titillation or victory in knowing that I was the only person that knew that that was a secret book. I mean, there was nothing of particular secret interest or value inside it, but still, it's knowing something that someone else doesn't know. This is part of the allure of spies and the spy genre for people that watch the films. So that was one technique that I picked up, and another one that I picked up, which was pretty cool, was you've got your chest of drawers, your dresser. If you pull the drawer out a little bit and then get a pencil and mark underneath how far the drawer has been pulled out, then you can find out if your parents or your siblings have been going through your stuff. So actually, I found the book really good for running a counterintelligence operation against my parents. so that's one part of it. But the more serious part goes back really to 9/11. So I joined the Royal Air Force back in the UK in 1998. I was in the photographic branch, intelligence and communications branch. I spent some time doing photographic intelligence. And while I was doing that, 9/11 happened, then Iraq happened. And I think for me, I just felt like an actor in a play who didn't really understand the plot. It's almost like being in a movie and no one's giving you the script and you're just improvising. And this is kind of the nature of life, right? But I just wanted to understand at a deeper level what was going on in the world. Like, how did my role in these events was utterly insignificant. I'm not putting myself at the center of this story at all. My role was insignificant in the story of 9/11, but 9/11 in the story of my life was quite powerful, because why would people fly planes into buildings and murder innocent people? I mean, it just, on the surface level, it just, like, why would someone do that? It doesn't seem to make any sense. So I just went on this journey to try to figure out what was going on in the world. And that led me to going back to, I left the service in 2005. I went back to school. I ended up doing a BA, an MA, a PhD, then some postdocs. And then quite fittingly, I ended up at the 9/11 Museum in New York City for a couple of years on a postdoctoral fellowship. And every day I would sit at my desk and ground zero, I could see the two huge uh, holes that were left by the North and South Tower. So, in some ways, that was the journey coming full circle. But, just to bring this back to your question, in 9/11, it's been called an intelligence failure by some people. The Iraq War, obviously, we had WMD. And the more you look into it, the more you see that at every critical juncture in history, intelligence is involved. It's just quite often we don't know as much as what went on compared to, say, let's think of the First World War. Well, there's actual trenches that you can go to walk through. You can see helmets and guns and so forth. So that's like on the surface. But the secret side to, say, World War One, that's more difficult to discover. So at every juncture, I think in history, there's intelligence has played some role. Sometimes it's a supporting actor. Sometimes it's the main player almost. We can think about America's entry to World War One, the Zimmerman telegram. We can think about Pearl Harbor. We can think about the Battle of Midway. So the Battle of Midway for the United States, that allowed a smaller and less experienced U.S. Navy to defeat the Japanese. That was intelligence. So I just became really fascinated in how the world worked, and I like the obviously the stuff you can see on the surface, but maybe this goes back to this childhood fascination. I'm interested in what happens underneath. I'm interested in what happens under the surface, or that sometimes is in plain sight, but we just don't see it for what it is. So that's how I really got pulled into that world. I had the job at the 9/11 Museum. I was in academia for a while. Then I had a fellowship at the Library of Congress, and the job came up at the Spy Museum. And they were looking for someone with a little bit of intelligence experience, a doctorate in diplomatic history, and some museum experience. So I managed to tick all the boxes, and for better or worse, they have me, and they're not getting rid of me.
So you could say you know what you're talking about.
Eh, I mean, it's always like a spectrum, right? But yeah, I mean, I've just spent an unhealthy amount of time reading and thinking and researching this stuff. So, yeah, there's certainly things that I know more than the average person on the street about.
Well, we've talked to, podcasters, we've talked to authors, we've talked to people that host, YouTube shows on, spy history. I'm just curious, though, someone who's working in a spy museum, what is sort of the duties of that and the challenges of the job?
Yeah, great question. So the duties, the best way to think about this is just breaking them down by function. So quite a lot of it is researching, organizing, and communicating information.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of on source almost to be a resource for the museum. So can you make sure that this is true? Can you fact check this? Can you do more research on this? Can you um, establish whether or not this actually happened or didn't happen? How far can we go in a statement? So that's the probably the more general level. When you break it down by function, you're talking about the collection. So at the heart of most museums is the objects, the things that people come to see. So I will research them. I will help to interpret them. I will just think about ways in which we can develop the artifacts that we have, the objects that we have. Then, if you go to exhibitions, I get involved in exhibitions, and the way to think about this is an exhibition is almost like a constellation that you see in the sky. So the objects are the individual stars, but they can be arranged and interpreted in a whole variety of different ways. You can see Orion, you can see the big chair. So the exhibition is almost making a constellation out of a variety of stars. And then the other part that I really love as well is hosting the podcast. I know I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but one of the great things about podcasting, besides a whole variety of other things, is just for the host. It's like every week I get a one-to-one tutorial with really interesting or smart people who know what they're talking about. So for me, it's just at heart, I think like even the most eminent professor is really just a student at heart. They're just trying to learn stuff. So for me, it's great. I just get to learn stuff every week. I get to ask interesting questions. I get to meet some really cool people. I'm not going to lie to you. CIA directors, GCHQ directors, people that have been involved in movies, directors, actors. So it's very, very cool. I really enjoy it. And then other things that I do are like media work. So quite often, for example, the Chinese spy balloon.
Mm.
So I was asked to comment on that, not because I have inside knowledge of Chinese government policy, but because, but because at the museum or as a historian, I can place that within a deeper historical context. So here at the museum, we have an area that looks at aerial reconnaissance, aerial intelligence. So from pigeons to planes to satellites to drones to U-2 spy planes that go up at twice the height of a commercial airliner, they're all variations of a theme. They're things that go up in the sky to try to gather intelligence. The spy balloon is actually probably the oldest one that's in existence. So people were perplexed. Why would you use a very analog technology in the modern age? So there's a number of ways that you can approach that. Um, for example, the utility of a spy balloon is that it can stay for a good period of time over an area. So it took quite a long time to travel across the United States. Whereas if it's a plane, a plane's like a shark; it can't stop swimming; it has to keep going. Then there's also plausible deniability that's involved. So it's a civilian weather balloon. What is it? Well, if we think about it logically, if we look at other civilians' weather balloons, we know actually that it's almost certainly not a civilian weather balloon. But part of the spy game is sometimes is keeping up the pretense, even if both sides know what's going on. If you can just keep up the pretense, then there's something going on there that I think is very interesting about intelligence and espionage. Whereas if you've got a Chinese pilot flying over the United States, you can't really keep up the pretense. There's a Chinese plane in our skies with a Chinese pilot wearing a Chinese uniform. There's no grayness that you can work with there.
One has far more intent than the other one.
Yeah, and this is one of the interesting things about espionage. It's a grey area. The whole cliche, the wilderness of mirrors for counterintelligence and so forth. So I just think it's a really fascinating space. And yeah, just to bring all that together, that's one of the final things that I do. Comment to the media, to newspapers, to TV, but it's generally, if not always, placing things in a historical context. So let's just try to understand this by looking a little bit at its history and how it got to where it is.
Yeah, which in a much smaller scale and a far less qualified scale, we've been trying to do with spy movies by covering the entire spectrum back to when they started in the 20s, all the way to now, 100 years of spy movies, and let's not just talk about the Mission Impossibles and the James Bonds. Let's talk about Tonight We Raid Calais from the 1940s. Strange films that people haven't heard of, but it helps you get an idea of why this genre has changed over the years. Speaking of that genre, and I note that you're sort of talking about your genesis with espionage, didn't really mention film and TV too much. So my final question for you is, what's your favorite spy movie of all time?
Oh, good question. So yeah, so you're right. So the movies at TV weren't really part of they're not what pulled me in.
Mm.
But I mean, I had always been fascinated by them independently. I remember as a kid sitting watching Thunderball and just being absolutely mesmerized by the underwater scenes.
Yes.
And I never understand why it gets slammed so much. I just think that it's an incredible movie. Like you sit there on a Sunday afternoon as an adult with a couple of beers, as a kid, and just put on Thunderball. I just think Emilio Largo's one of the most underrated Bond villains of all time, I think. The underwater scenes are incredible. There's just so much going on in the movie. So I have always loved the Bond movies, but I think that now, if you were to say to me, what's my favorite movie, I think it would probably be the Tinker Tailor. Well, we could go movie. If we're to go, say, just moving image, I would go with Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the one with Alec Guinness, sort of 9 episodes or whatever.
Right.
I think if we're to go for a movie, I would probably go for something like, The Good Shepherd, or maybe something like some ones that I've enjoyed recently have been The Courier on Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynn. We actually had the director on on our podcast a couple of years ago. So I know they're not, you guys know more about this genre than me. I know they're not considered like classics of the genre or whatever, but they're from my era, and they're bloody good movies to just sit and enjoy. I mean, The Good Shepherd, you could analyze that in all different types of ways, and kind of pull out things that are going on in there. And obviously, there's a healthy dose of fiction in there, but I just think it's a really good movie in its own terms.
No, for sure. And I think like you can get lost in the wilderness when it comes to sort of the spy action films. But I think that a lot of what is actually makes spy movies great is the stuff that doesn't involve explosions.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just me. I don't know. But I think it's time we talk about this week's film. And it's interesting because we bring on someone, yourself, Andrew, who has all of these credentials about real life spy activities. And we choose a completely fictionalized story. Cam, what do we have?
We are tackling 1966's Torn Curtain, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and starring Paul Newman and Julie Andrews.
Now, we've had a very good run so far with Alfred Hitchcock films.
Yeah.
Very good run. Notorious, 39 Steps, The Man Who Knew Too Much, both versions. It'd be interesting to see what everyone thinks about this one in a minute. For those of you who haven't seen Torn Curtain, here is the synopsis. Torn Curtain. It tears you apart with suspense. During the Cold War, an American scientist appears to defect to East Germany as part of a cloak and dagger mission to find a formula for a resin solution. But the plan goes awry when his fiancée, unaware of his motivation, follows him across the border. That one I like. That's a good synopsis there. That's a film I want to watch. Now, I am curious. I just want to add you before we get sort of our previous experiences with the film. I mean, I'd never seen this before. I'm sure Cam has, and I will bring that back to you in a second, Cam.
Yeah.
But Andrew, your sort of experiences, maybe not with this film, but Alfred Hitchcock's work as a whole, what are your sort of thoughts on him as a director and his spy films generally?
I mean, I think if you were to, I was saying to you my favorite movies there, like The Good Shepherd, The Courier and stuff. But I mean, if you were to push me, and I was in with a group of, grad students on film studies or something like that, I would probably start gravitating towards the Hitchcock movies for, best spy movies. So I think that for me, what is it? He has like 53 movies, 12 of them are on espionage or intelligence in some shape or form. So that's like quite a large percentage of his work. And he's, by the time Torn Curtain comes along in 66, he's already, made his name in the like 30s, I think it is, as the like, the master of suspense, right? And that all comes from like 39 Steps, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Sabotage, all those kinds of movies. So, yeah, he has, besides being a legendary director, he's a legendary director in this particular genre. And I actually came across something a while back, and it was saying that most people approach Hitchcock as Hitchcock the auteur. So, it's all about Hitchcock and his entire body of work. But it's actually quite interesting just to look at Hitchcock's spy movies to place Hitchcock as a director within the history of the spy genre. So not as Hitchcock wholesale, but as a spy movie director. So I just think that there's so much going on there. I mean, that could be a podcast that lasted for the next 99 hours. But what an incredible director, and what incredible movies.
Well, you just think like the Bond films that started a few years before this took a lot of their sort of bits and bobs from North by Northwest.
Yeah.
Like that really is kind of the start of it all. And this film, which I think Cam will get into in a minute, is really the answer to the first few Bond films. It's like Hitchcock's reaction to From Russia with Love. But Cam, I did sort of ride over you a second there. What was your first experience with Torn Curtain?
So Torn Curtain was one of the last ones I saw of that period of Hitchcock. There's still a couple of the early works. What I've always found inspiring about Alfred Hitchcock is that a lot of people look at him and go, genius. I could never, ever do what that man does. But when you watch like his first decade or so of films, you very much see someone who's like trying to figure out how to make them. Like it was not a born genius. It was someone who through effort and experimentation found his voice. And that's something I always found very cool about him. But I bought
was that the sixth Jason Bourne film there, Bourne Genius?
That's right. It was, yes. And I had bought the Universal DVD set back in the day, and there was a couple in that box set that were kind of regarded as the lesser Hitchcocks or the forgotten Hitchcocks, and those are the ones I kind of got to last. And Torn Curtain fell in that sort of category. And I remember watching it and having some issues with the pace, and I only saw it the once, so I was genuinely interested to watch it again because it had been maybe 10 years, maybe a little bit more since I'd seen it the first time.
Okay. I think that that sort of air about it being a lesser known Hitchcock or a lesser discussed Hitchcock, I think will come back up again in our discussions in a little bit. But Cam, I want to throw it back to you again. I'm interested to know how this draping got distressed.
So at the time of when this movie would have been happening, Hitchcock was in kind of a weird place. Psycho had been a massive hit, very much put him back on the map as one of the biggest directors in the world. And he had a couple, I don't want to say bumpy, but just like follow-ups that, while great, weren't as commercially received to the level of Psycho. And those were Marnie and The Birds, two movies that people were generally hold up as masterworks at this point in time, but in the 1960s people were a little mixed on them. And so he began to get a little bit like nervous how to recapture that audience attention he got from Psycho. So he was developing 3 projects. He was developing one, it was an adaptation of the play Mary Rose, which was a supernatural drama, a film called RRRR, not to be confused with RRR.
The sequel that we never got. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. The prequel.
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Which was about an Italian immigrant coming to America. That was an original concept.
Is it not a pirate film? Arr.
I like that. And then the third was an adaptation of the book The Three Hostages, written by John Buchan, and this was a Haney novel. So it would have been a delayed sequel to the 39 Steps in some way.
Wow, okay. Better than the Kenneth More one, for sure.
Yeah. And this was going to be Hitchcock's 50th movie that he was going to be making. Okay. So I think there's a bit of pressure. It's like commercially, he doesn't feel ultra confident. It's his 50th movie. And so he decided ultimately on this project. And what happened was he was inspired by the 1951 defection of English spies Burgess and McLean from the Cambridge Five. Perhaps, Andrew, do you have a bit of background on these individuals?
I do, yeah. We look at the Cambridge Five at the museum. We look particularly at Kim Philby, but he's almost the Russian doll at the centre of the Cambridge Five. And Burgess and McLean, of course, it's Philby that tipped them off. So there's lots to dig into there in terms of the history of espionage, and especially during the Cold War.
Yeah, and so Hitchcock, had been following the events of Burgess and McLean defecting, and his main thought was, what must Mrs. McLean have thought? And that was sort of the germ of what inspired this movie.
I like it.
And he was very aware of the James Bond boom. So what he was looking to do with Torn Curtain was to showcase the dirty side of the spy world. He wanted to make something that was contrary to James Bond. and he was looking to do something kind of in the vein of Notorious, and had absolutely zero interest in Cold War political themes. He emphasized this to his writers.
And it shows.
Yes. And so he commissioned a script from writer Brian Moore, who was an Irish novelist and screenwriter. He'd had a couple of his books adapted into movies, 1958's Intent to Kill and 1964's The Luck of Ginger Coffee, which was directed by Liquidator director Jack Cardiff.
The legendary Jack Cardiff. Who could forget the Liquidator? I often do get emails saying, "When are you going to do more Liquidator coverage?" Of course,
Exactly.
that's a joke. That's a joke. That's never happened.
But primarily Brian Moore's work, if you look at his filmography, it's mostly his novels being adapted into films. But he did write the screenplay for a movie in 1991 called The Black Robe, directed by Bruce Beresford, that got a fair amount of acclaim. This was his debut screenplay, though. So he really was not practiced in terms of writing screenplays and went through several drafts. And ultimately, Hitchcock brought in the writing pair of Willis Hull and Keith Waterhouse, who were just a duo that were veterans in the industry, began writing British TV in the late 50s, and just cranked out TV scripts, did the odd movie. They wrote the 1961 Haley Mills thriller, Whistle Down the Wind, and also the Guy Hamilton World War II film, The Winston Affair. But primarily TV, and they were brought in after several drafts from Moore to punch up Torn Curtain. And they did that uncredited, but if you look up the history on Torn Curtain, they are constantly referenced. Like, they were seen as a very important part in sort of getting the movie across the line to a screenplay they could use.
It's funny, you're already throwing shade on the initial writer. It's like, it's his first film, total novice. What an amateur this guy is. What a hack. All right.
And was it Hitchcock? I may be getting this wrong, but was it Hitchcock that said, someone said, "What's the key to a good movie?" And he said, "Script, script, script."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But he's not happy with the script for this movie, and I think around this time he comments that it's very difficult to find a good writer these days, or something like that.
Yes, and
poor guy.
It's so weird.
Poor guy.
And it's so weird because we think of like Hitchcock as the master of suspense, but apparently he was like quite insecure at this point in time. He wasn't certain about the movie, but they had to rush it into production because Julie Andrews was going to be busy, and Universal wanted her really badly, and also Paul Newman. And there was also an issue that like Hitchcock was very much nervous about his box office standing and was basically taking notes from Universal and ceding control of the project to basically try to engineer a box office hit with them.
That seems so counterintuitive for Hitchcock, the man who at this point had done basically all of his hits.
I know. It just shows you, though, like, anyone can get imposter syndrome, right?
That's true.
And so, through the production, Hitchcock was not a fan of Paul Newman, largely stemming from unclassy behavior at a private dinner. And also, Newman sent him a 3-page memo of notes on the script. And also, Paul Newman was a method actor, and Hitchcock had no patience whatsoever for method acting.
I mean, I got Andrew's memo before we did this. It was 20 pages front and back about how he wants to be treated on this podcast. So I know how Hitch feels, man. It's tough.
Yeah, thanks for the camel milk for my bath after the show.
How are those green M&Ms doing for you?
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite interesting, like thinking about this in the history of cinema, and thinking about the various people that are in it. So Julie Andrews comes off of the back of Mary Poppins, wins an Oscar for it.
Mm-hmm.
Then The Sound of Music, which surpasses Gone with the Wind to become the highest grossing movie in cinema history. So she's at the height of her power, so to speak. Hitchcock comes off of Vertigo and North by Northwest, Birds and Psycho. So he's just made, I think, what most people consider his greatest movies, but Torn Curtain is really his star on the wane. He only makes, is it 2 or 3 more movies after this?
Yeah.
And none of them are really ones that people remember. But then Paul Newman, he's a bit different because to me, he's sort of like halfway between both of them, because he's coming to this from he's coming to this from so previously he's known as for Cat on the Hot Tin Roof and The Hustler. So they're kind of like big movies, right? He's like a known name, he's like a big star. But I think that some of his best work is still in front of him. Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, The Sting, those types of things. And so you've got those three people who are really important for the history of cinema. They all collide in this spy movie, Torn Curtain. So that's one thing that's interesting to me. And then, as you say, it's like almost a generational clash on the set, right? Hitchcock is used to dealing with, Cary Grant, Sean Connery and Marnie, that older generation, Jimmy Stewart. But then he's got Paul Newman, his chest's out quite a lot on Torn Curtain. He's a method actor. I read that he said he asked Churchill, what are my characters' like inner motivations? And he said, like, your main motivation is money, getting paid to do this bloody movie, And it reminds me of this. I don't know if this story is apocryphal or not, but for the movie Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman like ran around the block so that he could actually be out of breath, and Laurence Olivier said to him, "What the hell are you doing?" And he's like, I'm getting in character, I'm out of breath. And Laurence Olivier says, "Have you ever heard of this thing called acting?"
Yes.
So there's this kind of generational clash going on in the movie as well, I think.
Yeah, that was Marathon Man.
And Marathon Man, sorry, that's right, yeah. Not Rain Man.
Yeah, that was always one of those legendary stories. Did it actually happen? I don't know, but the story is amazing. So print the legend, right?
Exactly.
And because in this film, Paul Newman and Julie Andrews were so expensive, the studio decided to skimp on a lot of the production. So they hired like a very cheap German crew to shoot all the background plates, which will explain maybe some of the dodgy backgrounds in this film. And also, Hitchcock had this long collaboration with Bernard Herrmann, who'd done a lot of his best scores, North by Northwest, Psycho, Vertigo, and he hired him to write a very poppy score for this movie. The idea was, it's the 60s, people are really into the kind of these pop music kind of scores, so we'd like you to do that. And Bernard Herrmann handed in a very moody, depressing score, and Hitchcock had to basically cut him. And so that was the last of their collaborations, the unreleased score of Torn Curtain, and he brought in John Addison instead.
Had Herman been watching the film, like watching dailies, and that was what inspired him for the sort of moody and depressing?
That is an excellent question, because I agree with you. Like when you watch the movie, I think it seems like kind of a slow burn, kind of moody thriller. I don't think
it's a contemplative thriller. Yeah, like it's not You Only Live Twice.
I don't think of like the Wrecking Crew, like bop 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 kind of music playing under this thing. Yeah,
weird.
Yeah. And so the movie was a modest success. It had a budget of $3 million. Domestically, it did $7 million. International numbers, it's 1960s. It's very tough to track that information. The top three for the year: number one, The Bible in the Beginning. Number two was Hawaii, the Julie Andrews film. And number three was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And it's notable, this was a big year for the spy craze. You also had coming out this year Murderers Row, Our Man Flint, Funeral in Berlin, The Deadly Affair. This is like right in that post-Thunderball explosion of these types of movies. So, yeah, big time to be putting out Torn Curtain as a spy film, and it was successful for that. And my final note was actor Ludwig Donath, who plays Lind in this film. This was his final kind of major film. He died of leukemia the year after the release of this film in 1967 at the age of 67. And his only other spy credit that would come out after this movie was the packaging of the Man from U.N.C.L.E. film, The Spy in the Green Hat, released in 1967.
I will note, you listed all those spy films that came out this year, but you missed the most important one, Ken.
Oh boy, okay. I'm sure this is a joke, so now I'm racking my brains as to what was the bad spy movie we covered from 1966. You're gonna have to let me know.
It involves a sandwich.
A sandwich?
Oh, the listeners are screaming it in your ear right now. It's Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs came out this year too.
They weren't screaming in my ears, they were just screaming.
In the cinemas, yeah.
Yeah.
Quite right. Well, I think we should all get inside the basket and try to sneak over the sort of Berlin Wall here. Torn Curtain time. Let's talk about it. Andrew, you're our guest. You go first. You've revisited the film for the show. What do you think about Torn Curtain?
So I think that the takeaway is, so I watched it last night. I had seen parts of it in the past, but I watched it last night. So I think for a Tuesday evening, it's actually not a bad use of a couple of hours. I think that, would it be if you can only watch a dozen movies this year, would you put it in the list? Probably not. But if you're just looking for a good Hitchcock movie to watch and to be titillated and to see, the old master, bring out a few of his tricks and see what he can do with Julie Andrews and Paul Newman as opposed to, Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant, then I think that it's worth a watch. I think I would probably, if I was to rank it out of 10, I would probably give it like 6 or something like that. So it just depends on what you're, maybe it's because it's the genre that you're happy to watch it regardless. If your interests are a bit broader, then maybe your level is a 7. I only watch movies that are a 7 or above. Maybe if you're a Paul Newman fan, as I am, you would watch it because of that. So I think that there's lots of reasons to watch it, but it's certainly, no one's going to make an argument unless I'm drastically wrong in this podcast that it's, Hitchcock's greatest movie or really any of their greatest movies.
I don't think you're in the right place for that. I think it might be a very different opinion from the two of us. I did think you were going somewhere completely different with your statement at the beginning, though. Because you said it was a Tuesday night, kind of put it on. I just thought, like, he's tired from work. It's Tuesday night. I thought you were going to say you fell asleep halfway through. Honestly, thought that's where you were going with that.
No, I didn't. I didn't.
Okay, so that sounds like you're going to give it a thumbs up. A 6 or 7 out of 10 is a pretty good score as far as films go. Cam, I'm interested to hear from you, Mr. Hitchcock fan. What do you think of Torn Curtain?
So I'm not going to lie. I went into this one with a little bit of dread, just because my experience watching it the first time was it was pretty underwhelming, where I walked away from it going, okay, that's probably going to be more or less a one and done.
Mhm.
Like, I don't have a lot of interest in revisiting this one the way I do with a lot of his other work that I'll just keep going back to. I actually found my experience watching it last night much more pleasant than the first time, but the issues became clearer to me, I think, than the first time. It was just kind of like, boy, this movie just never ends, does it? Whereas, like, this time, it does feel like kind of, when you watch a Hitchcock movie, especially the ones that just feel so refined to the core of what he does best, whether it's North by Northwest or Psycho, they feel just like driven by inspiration from beginning to end. And this one, like, I can feel like so much with the behind the scenes, talking about the insecurity he had. Like, it doesn't feel as inspired as a lot of his work. There's a lot of scenes where I'm like, it just doesn't have like the Hitchcock energy that I'm used to. But it's like there's sprinkling throughout of moments that when we talk about like likes, I'll have a lot of sequences I can talk about. And so it's sort of like this movie that keeps kind of like lulling you into a, boy, not a lot's happening. And then it'll like goose you with like, oh wow, he just came to life and I am riveted watching this sequence. But it doesn't feel like he has found like a really strong way to string the sequences together like he does in his best work. There's a lot of like talkiness, and that's typically not one of his strengths. He's such a visual filmmaker and an emotional filmmaker. When you think of the suspense and like how he can have you just filled with anxiety in his work, he seems to be struggling with that here. Like, a lot of what it is driven by kind of like an intellectual concept. It is a mathematical formula that Paul Newman needs to retrieve from this, East Berlin scientist. It doesn't feel like Hitchcock has a good grasp on how to make that ultra compelling. And I think he struggles throughout. I like the idea of the romance between the two and how that informs the story, having kind of the shifting POV of her seeing, her fiance joining the Soviets versus like him trying to get her out of there. That's a great idea. I think the problem is you have zero romantic spark between these two leads. And I'll talk more about that later. But overall, I walked away from it, I think, with more appreciation. And there was some sequences that I will revisit where I was like, wow, I didn't realize at the time I watched it the first time how alive he was in specific moments. But overall, I just think it's a frustrating late career package.
It's like you can kind of hear him butting up against himself. Like he's definitely trying to struggle to get over things in this film, and that really was what I had to deal with. Now, I didn't have that experience you did, Cam. I wasn't coming back to it. I hadn't seen bits of it before, like Andrew had, and then coming to it as like a whole piece. I've just sat down and watched this 2 times in a row over the last 2 days, fresh.
Yeah.
No perspective on it. I'd heard rumblings about it being both good and bad, so I had no sort of real vision going into it. What I found was myself becoming increasingly frustrated throughout this film. You know, it's got so many great things going for it. There's some amazing scenes, like Cam said, that I want to get into as well. Yeah, you've got Hitch at the the peak of his fame. You've got Paul Newman and Julie Andrews, names that I think anyone knows. These are the top class creme de la creme of actors that you want in your film, and of such an intriguing story that I'd love to see more from. And yet, none of it sort of forms into a united, amazing film that it could have been. I just felt this lack of potential, a sort of lack of achieving its own potential, I should say, throughout the film. And it just kept frustrating me. It never sort of reached the sum of its own parts, nor did it ever exceed them. And so I was like, well, that's a shame. That's a real shame, because, as I say, there's moments where I, like Cam said, it's goosing you, I think, as Cam said. I love it, and I go back to them, standing around or talking, and it's like, oh boy. And it has this real, like, I think Cam has mentioned this before, the Return of the King style endings, where it ends about 3 times.
Yeah.
And it should have ended the first time. I will just say that. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. But yeah, frustrating is my takeaway from it. But there's a lot to enjoy, which I think brings us over to the likes. And I want to celebrate this film a little bit.
So just on the kind of, the two-sided dimension to this movie. So I dug out a couple of reviews. One recently on Slate, and I think this captures some of what you were describing, Scott. The headline of the review was, "It's not a total disaster." So
what more does a filmmaker want than that said about their work?
Exactly. And then I found one from back in the day, at the time the movie came out, and this is in the New York Times. And the reviewer says, "Mr. Newman goes at it really as though he meant to pick a German scientist's brain, and Miss Andrews is like an English nanny who means to see that no harm comes to him." And I think that that is perhaps a bit harsh, but I think it just attests to the fact that the two of them do look a bit out of place, both in the movie and with each other. There's just looking at it on the surface, like watching it last night, I mean, by any yardstick, those are two good-looking human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very aesthetically pleasing thing to look at, but there's just no chemistry between them whatsoever. Which is, I don't know. I guess I just expected more from the two of them with each other, but they seemed out of place in the movie and with each other.
I think the problem is like Julie Andrews, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music. Like, she is very much a mainstream, audience-pleasing star who is very accessible to an audience, and she's fun to hang out with. Paul Newman is very insular. He's coming out of that method school where it's so much about reading into the deep emotions going beneath the surface of his characters. These are not two things that belong together. One is a very, I think, giving actor. Julie Andrews is just very giving of her scene partners, whereas I think like Paul Newman is like, focus in on what I'm trying to get across in this moment. And it just is a very weird dynamic for a romance.
Well, this is one of the criticisms that's made of method actors, right? It's like, I remember someone said that De Niro's never done a great love scene, and it's partly because he's lost in his own interiority. He's too in his own head, thinking about the motivations and the drives and impulses of the character. So he's not kind of connecting at that level with a love interest or something. So, I mean, that's like a whole separate argument, but I do think that you see a little bit of that with Paul Newman. And I wonder as well, because Hitchcock is there for the birth of cinema and then through the early days. And a lot of the movies then are, it's almost like the theatre sort of spills over and kind of reinvents itself in cinema, and then later on you have all of method actors and Tarkovsky and all of these people that are kind of going off in a different direction. But people like Hitchcock and even Bergman and so forth, they're very much, it's like a play that's been modified for the movie. And I think that plays, like method acting, just doesn't come across on very well in a play. That it's all about a very slight gesture to the camera. It's about them seeing a particular emotion in your eyes or written on your face. If you're in a theater, like the audience is not going to see that. So I feel like Hitchcock comes out of that and works better when he's with actors that get that a bit more. And I mean, of course, like Paul Newman, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. It's not like these people had never been in the theater, but I just think that there's a different. I think that Hitchcock works in an older and different version of theater that you see coming out of early Hollywood. And I think that people like Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, I think, are two of the great examples of those types of actors that you know are just of a different generation. Again, it goes back to that generational clash. Sorry.
And I think it's notable too, like Hitchcock worked with Montgomery Clift on I Confess in the 50s, and Montgomery Clift was a method actor as well. But it's notable that he worked with both Clift and Newman once. He did not go back for round two. So
I really want to know what sort of method acting De Niro was doing on Bad Grandpa.
you don't want to know, Scott. You don't want to know.
That's a whole other podcast as well. I think we'll save that for someone else. But no, let's celebrate a little bit. Let's have some joy in this
For
torn
sure.
curtain. Let's find some things that we like. Andrew, you're up first. Something you liked about the film.
So well, I thought that on the whole, again, it was a 6, but I thought that there were some real gems. There were some real scenes that will stay with me. So one is at the very end, the women in furs and diamonds. She was actually a ballerina in real life, and she plays a ballerina at the end of the movie, who's shouting "Amerikanische Spione," American spy. I won't give the plot of the movie away. I don't know if that's what you normally.
Oh no,
do
go
for
ahead.
show.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go nuts.
So basically, this leads to the East German guards shooting these boxes that they think Julie Andrews and Paul Newman are hiding in, but they're not actually in them. But I just think that she's quite an arresting figure, because you think of the bleak, grayness of East Germany and the set and the humdrum drudgery of life in a communist country, and then you've got this like fabulous woman with diamonds and furs, a real prima donna, but she supports the system, and she's, there's American spies, capture them. So that stood out for me, and I think that actor, she's got a really arresting face. I think that she's just one of those people that you stop and you notice and you look at. I can mention another few, but I'll just stick to one for now. So I thought there was some really great little nuggets in the movie.
Well, I just love the prima donna because it's set up earlier. Like at the beginning of the film, you've got your lead stepping off a plane, or not quite at the start, but close to, and the prima donna's coming off first, and she thinks the press are there to see her, but
Exactly.
it turns out they're there to see Paul Newman, and she gets screw face and walks off, and then you see her sort of towards the end, and then she thinks she will be the downfall of them because she craves attention. That's where it's coming from. There's a nice little setup and payoff there. I like that.
And she's at that party as well at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
Like she's kind of like just throughout the course of the movie, she just keeps popping up. It's really good setup and then continuing, and there is a great payoff, but not the payoff she probably expected.
No, she just gets ignored again, unfortunately.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And her character is foiled ultimately.
No, and I think sort of continuing Andrew's and just, we mentioned, I think Cam and I both said it, so maybe we should also talk about it, is just some great moments from the film, because I have some other likes I want to bring up, but like for me, the thing I will certainly not forget is the death of the East German agent Gromuk. Like, I just think his murder, as it were, prolonged 5-minute sequence of slowly beating someone up to death and then throwing them in like the oven to finish them off. It's played with no music in the background. It's brutal. Like the knife breaks in his chest. Both trying to strangle each other. And I know Hitchcock did this to take a shot at Bond, how not easy it is to actually kill someone. Although I wonder why Hitchcock knows that, but we'll leave that to one side. But I just love seeing that. Well, I really enjoy seeing that on screen because it's that sort of grittiness that I think the film struggles to achieve at other times because there's some tone problems with the film as well. But that moment in isolation, I think, is fantastic.
I think, like, for me, Gromek was my, like, MVP of the movie, played by Wolfgang Keeling. This character has so much menace. It's almost like the Peter Lorre character. Like, you could see him. Yeah, you could see him playing that character. And, like, that subtle element of menace that just operates underneath the surface of the movie every time he walks on screen and, you know, throws out his kind of amusing quips about his knowledge of America. But, like, there's always this kind of veiled danger to him. And I love that this scene that you talk about is just like an explosion of it. And you can see that Hitchcock's pushing kind of the limits of what you can get away with in a movie. Like, to have the knife stuck with all the blood coming down, that's not something Hitchcock could have done in a film, you know, 10 years earlier. You see him kind of pushing that envelope a bit, and he'll do it even more so in things like Frenzy in the 70s. To me, that sequence is the reason to watch Torn Curtain. Just absolutely incredible. And the way they kind of escalate, yeah, as you said, from knives to shovels to the gas furnace. I mean, the movie just comes to life. And to me, I'll kind of jump off of that. Some of the other sequences that really worked for me. I have a lot of problems with the finale in terms of the pacing and the number of sequences. But there are two of them for me that I thought were fantastic. One is the bus escape with kind of the ticking clock of when the other bus is going to reach them or potentially pass them. And how there's all these little obstacles, and you can feel Hitchcock's sense of humor coming to life when there's like the older woman who has to get on the bus because they've now got to make proper stops because they're being escorted by the military. Really funny stuff, and also suspenseful. Probably should have been the ending of the movie.
I wrote that down. That should have been the exact end. They get past the border and they do they shake hands and off they go, and you get that little photo scene. But that build up and the bus slowly getting closer in the sort of rear projection they're using at the back of the bus set is great, and all the sort of things that get in the way, the obstacles, and you've got like the German lady on the bus as well that's constantly shouting at them, saying, "You're making us late," and "What are you doing?" And I loved all of that because it's the tension that Hitchcock is great at doing, and that is. I wish there was more of that in the rest of the film, to be honest with you.
I think it was like, to me, it was like a little bit like watching Italian soccer. Like, there's long moments of just, they're passing the ball. You know, there's not much happening. It's like a game of chess. You're just like, oh, you know, it's going. And then all of a sudden it's like, holy smoke. Did you see that? Like, someone just hit a 35-yard free kick and it just went into the top left-hand corner of the net. Holy smoke. So it's just like long moments of kind of relative flatness punctuated by just really amazing scenes. And I think that the death scene is great. And one thing that I loved about that is the woman who at the very end is dragging the East German guard Stasi guy over to the oven. And you just the camera will go up and look at her, and you see the grimace in her face, and she yanks him in the body, and the camera move, and you almost feel like Hitchcock is moving you, even though you're just sitting on your ass watching the movie. Like, he really makes you feel like you're caught up in that struggle to get this person to, you know, drag them over and put their head in an oven. So I just thought that was like really just incredibly well done. And I think that he makes it uncomfortable, right? Paul Newman at this point is going purple. You know, there's, you know, I think if he said, you know, he says that he sets out to provide a corrective to this, like in spy movies, you know, you have one karate chop and someone hits the deck and they're dead. Well, he definitely proves his point. You know, it goes on and it's a bit uncomfortable, but you really feel like you're caught up in it, or at least I did. So I thought that was the 35-yard free kick that went into the top left-hand corner of the net.
Well, it's the way he shifts POV too to make these sequences so effective. And the other one I was just going to mention was honestly the theater sequence. It's one too many sequences in the finale, but again, when you have them sitting in the theater, they're watching the play, and there's the security and the military coming down to check people, each row, the way they build that ticking clock, and have the Newman yelling fire, and the way they staged the people being dragged in separate directions in a crowd, incredible filmmaking. Like that could be the finale of any movie, and you'd be like, what a fantastic finale. This movie has like 3 finales, which is maybe a problem, but you can't really argue with the staging of the specific like high points of these sequences.
I thought that was an incredible scene as well, where the crowd is like swaying and they're caught up in the crowd and people are going in different directions and Paul Newman's really struggling to get to Julie Andrews. So I just thought that was like so well done. But again, as you said, it's just like it went on and we thought it closed, and then it went on a bit more and we thought it closed, and it went on a bit more. But that was another great scene, I thought.
I did have a small bugbear with the orchestra opera scene, and that's that Paul Newman shouts out "fire" in a German-speaking audience, and "fire" isn't their word for fire; it's "Früher."
Yeah,
Fire.
yeah.
Which it's not. It's not quite fire. I mean, I get it. Like if someone screams during a very silent crowd, you'd probably be like, "What's going on?" But it'd be like me shouting it out in, I don't know, Spanish in Japan and expecting everyone to be like, "Ah, fire!" It wouldn't make any sense. But that's a tiny, tiny, tiny thing.
I'm sure the German version that played in theaters in the 60s had that properly dubbed over.
Well, I think that this is quite interesting as well, because when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I'd done some research and wrote a paper on freedom of speech. And shouting fire in a theatre is actually one of the classic analogies that's used in debates about freedom of speech. So Oliver Wendell Holmes, a Supreme Court justice in the United States, he said that, freedom of speech stops at shouting fire in a theater and causing like a mass panic. That's not freedom of speech. You're harming other people. So this is, I don't know if Hitchcock knew of this reference. I'm guessing he maybe did. It's not super well known, but known by certain people in the States. So that's quite interesting to me. Shouting fire in a theater, that is literally the example that Oliver Wendell Holmes used about the limits of freedom of speech, and that's the one that people will use in the contemporary debates and about the limits of freedom of speech.
I want to highlight something else apart from sort of individual scenes, and that is not only the main cast. I think the main cast don't have great chemistry and are probably not in the right films, but the supporting cast of this film, I think, deserve a tip of the hat. We mentioned Gromek, the sort of East Berlin guard, but you've got a few. You've got Professor Lint, who pops in and gives a very strange performance that you don't forget. And then my favorite, although you could have cut all of her scenes out and it wouldn't have mattered, Lida Kudrova as Countess Kaczynska. She's great. It's just a weird energy for like 20 minutes trying to get an American sponsor. It woke me up, I have to say. Like, I appreciated the energy coming into the film, because Paul Newman and what's her name, going off my top of my head, Julie Andrews, weren't giving me quite as much energy as the Countess did in her 15 minutes of screen time.
The Countess creates a little world in this like just isolated scene that you're like, wow. You hear so much about like, there's no such thing as like small parts, only small actors. And like this woman creates an entire universe, and you suddenly have all this insight into her motivations, that moment where she trips the guard, and like her life is over. She's going to be arrested and probably sent to prison, and she's weeping over her sponsor. You're like, oh my God, this is like a heartbreaking mini movie happening in the midst of this like 2-hour espionage caper. It's, on one hand, it's like completely out of place and completely destroys the momentum of the finale, because there's a part where she's going on and on about the sponsor, and it was cutting to Paul Newman's just indifferent look. And I was like writing in my notes, like, I kind of understand where Paul Newman's coming from right now. But at the same time, in isolation, it's fantastic. And I was also a big fan of the Lint character, and that scene where Newman is basically trying to trick him into revealing the secret formula on the blackboard by playing to his ego. And it's a sequence that when it started, I was like, how does this even work? Where I'm watching two people on a chalkboard writing mathematical equations. I'm like, oh boy, you have lost me. But I do think like there is that level of one-upsmanship, and just like the way that Newman tricks him. And I love actually the moment where Lind realizes what he's done, and Newman is just like completely ignoring him. Is just sitting there staring at the board, memorizing what's on it, as Lind is like, wait a second, and going to like phone for security. And I love that pause of just Newman staring at the board.
Yeah, you know exactly what he's doing because you're in on it, but you're actually then like sort of hearing the professor's sort of gears going in his head as he's actually now figuring out this is an enemy agent, basically from his perspective, and because he's got those subtle cues before, like the school grounds are trying to find him and stuff like that, and it clicks eventually. And you see that sort of betrayal, which I think is great. The only other like I had, which I'll just and maybe I'll throw it out for anyone else's interpretations and opinions, is just I think the story is quite intriguing. And I think if of all the films I've seen of Hitchcock so far, this is the one I think I would most like to be seen remade.
Right.
Maybe delivered differently without three endings, but I think this whole like defector double agent story to try and get nuclear, codes or whatnot, you can change the things in the location. It can be Russia or something like that if you wanted to modernize the story. But I think the nugget of the story and sort of seeing this is almost like a Bond film from the Bond girl's perspective for the good sort of the first act at least. And I love that. That's sort of the Spy Who Loved Me book style of seeing this, grand spy story from someone else's perspective. I really liked that.
Well, it's like, what was the point of Gus Van Sant remaking Psycho? Remake one like this, where it's like, you have genius in there, but it's not refined to a completely successful, whole.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the scene where they're both writing the theorems and equations and so forth on the board, for me, that was really fascinating just thinking about it as a historian, because so much of the history of the Cold War was basically a struggle and a war between physicists and mathematicians, and it was the appliance of science. The Cold War in some ways was a massive research and development contest. And this is, the trying to harness people's brains so that you can build better or more efficient, or some to build something that gives you an edge in the Cold War contest. So I thought that was, that was a really nice scene in and of itself. But I thought that you could extrapolate that out to be the struggle of the Cold War, even the Manhattan Project. The struggle to get the bomb before the Nazis, and then during the Cold War, it was theoretical physicists, mathematicians, and so forth that were really leading the arms race in many ways, because they were the people that were coming up with the technology and the workarounds and so forth that would allow it to happen.
And now they're having films made about them. By the time this is out, Oppenheimer would be out in cinemas, I think, and that is getting a whole 3-hour Christopher Nolan film.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And there's another one coming out this summer on Ted Hall, who was in the Manhattan Project, and it's called The Compassionate Spy. And yeah, that's coming out. So you've got the Oppenheimer one, who's obviously the leader of the project, but then you've got, I think, the youngest person on the project, Ted Hall. I think he's like 20 years old, and he actually leaks a lot of intelligence to the Soviets to help them in their effort to build the bomb, which obviously comes along in 1949. So I think that these are good examples, as you say, a 3-hour Christopher Nolan treatment, and then another one, A Compassionate Spy.
Now, I think before I take us over to dislikes, just throwing it out quickly, is there any other likes people want to mention at all?
I like the sequence where Paul Newman and Julie Andrews are having like the disagreement, and you're seeing it entirely in silence as people are observing it happen. I thought that was actually really effective. And then you cut into them basically, the audio kicks in of their conversation. You realize that they're basically spilling the beans as to exactly what's going on, and they are on the same page. But I love the way that's staged.
I do love that scene, but I do feel like it was all a complete set, and it just felt like a set. That really bugged me about that.
I think I really liked Paul Newman's fashion in the movie. I remember he would have on like a crisp, classy white shirt, a burgundy tie, a blue suit. He was dressed sharp. I thought that he looked good. I also thought it was not necessarily alike, but I thought it was interesting that Julie Andrews at this point, I think she's only 32, but she seems, I don't know if she's made to look older or if she just looks older. And then she's also very much not the Hitchcockian blonde, the icy blonde. She's something different.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, and in terms of like, I think they were trying to make her look a little. I don't know if it was older or it was like we need to make her look like a physicist, whatever that
Okay.
means, or like a scientist, and that's
Yeah.
like Hitchcock's interpretation of what
Yeah,
that looks like.
that could be the reason, yeah.
I just also wonder if it's like you have Julie Andrews coming out of Mary Poppins and Sound of Music. This is the '60s. It's a little bit of a different era. They are not going to make her look, Hitchcock sexy. Like, there's just no way that the studio would allow that.
Well, I read before that Hitchcock originally wanted Eva Marie Saint
Mm,
after her term in North by Northwest to come back for this one.
right.
So that would fit into that. And I'll note, Andrew points out that how well dressed Paul Newman is. Of the three of us, this is an audio podcast, but of the three of us, Andrew's the only one wearing a dress shirt.
That is true. Very true.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Keeping the lights on at SpyHards HQ ain't cheap. And frankly, nor is feeding this school of attack piranhas. So we need your help.
Roger that, Scott. Only at the SpyHards Patreon can you gain access to exclusive shows like Agents in the Field, which tackles non-spy films starring your favorite spy icons, and The Debrief, where we channel our inner solitaires and predict how the big spy movie news of today will impact tomorrow.
So make like a Treadstone agent and activate your Patreon membership at patreon.com/spyhards today. Cam, tell the people what we have in our sights this week.
Well, Las Vegas Celebration Month continues, and we are taking a look at a movie that's more than a little unusual. I'm talking about 1996's Mars Attacks. Strap yourself in for this one, folks. Ack, 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 ack.
But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy chinks. Well, there you go. Let's head on over to dislikes. It sounds like we have a few to discuss. Andrew, you're up first. Give us a dislike.
Okay, a dislike. I think that, just to go back to it. Oh, in fact, can I sneak in one more like?
Go
You
for
can
it.
sneak it. You can
Yeah.
sneak it.
So the bit at the end in the theater where everybody's rushing out of the theater, and there's this amazing shot where Hitchcock is at the top of the camera's at the top of a stairwell. It's looking down the stairwell. If you imagine a
Yeah.
stairwell with, say, 8 flights of floors, and then you just see the people snaking around and holding on to the railings, snaking their way down to the bottom. And I just thought that was a really nice angle, and it really brought, I don't know, it was almost like a painting by Hieronymus Bosch or something, where you see people descending into different regions of hell or something like that. But I just thought the way that they were snaking down was like a really nice shot.
Yeah, it's like Hitchcock, just such an amazing visual imagination. And I feel like there's less of that in this movie than some of his other work, but those moments still really pop when they do happen.
Crazy that when he's firing on like no cylinders, he's still getting shots like that.
Yeah, exactly. Like in a movie nowadays, if you had one shot like that in the movie, people would be celebrating it. And he's
Yeah.
just kind of like throwing them around randomly in this movie. And people are like, you know what? This is not good enough.
Well, Andrew, you are the spy expert, so you did sneak in a like, but I have to press you. What's your dislike?
My dislike. So again, I was just really disappointed in I think the pacing of the script. It wasn't like the Hitchcock that there had been like previously. It's just, I know that he had frustrations. I know that he shopped it around different people trying to whip it into shape, but maybe this goes back to the point that you made earlier, Cam, where it just doesn't feel like he's fully invested in it seems to me that in the past he had an idea, he had a vision, and he ran with it. And in the end, after several decades of refining his craft, like you said, it wasn't, just genius that was sprinkled upon him when he was born. After several decades of the craft, he was just capable of taking a project, running with it, getting towards his vision, and the end result was just amazing cinema, amazing movies. But it seems like with this, it was almost like he's just like, give me a formula that you think is going to be a box office hit. Okay, we've got Julie Andrews, we've got Paul Newman, we've got this, we've got that, but it's just a bit discombobulated. And I think that the pace of the script at some moments it was good to be trapped in that scene in the theater where everybody's struggling to go one way or the other. I thought that it was good to keep you there for like a few moments. I thought that the death scene, it was good to be kept there for a few moments, but there were other places where, we should just really have been spared the amount of time that we had to spend in particular places in the movie. So I just think that the pacing of the movie was a big dislike for me, I think.
There's a weird combination, I think, going on where when you look at like North by Northwest, it is assembled out of set pieces and it's very much carrying you by the seat of your pants. And you can sit there if you have a second and be like, wait a second, would this really lead into this happening? But because the movie's so confident and exciting and energetic, you're just along for the ride. But then you get like Hitchcock doing something like The Birds, which has this kind of like real slow burn, kind of apocalyptic ending to it, where it's very slow, methodical, and it sucks you in. You can kind of see the energy of where the zombie movie would come from. You can understand how that was kind of ground zero for kicking off that whole zombie concept in the way he's staging The Birds ending. This to me feels like he's trying to mesh the two things. The North by Northwest espionage caper stuff with the slow burn tension of like the finale of The Birds, and it's like these two things are just butting up against each other. You cannot have a slow burn last half hour of this movie where it's like these really dynamic set pieces but with long, shoe leather is the best term, walking from one place to the next to get into the next sequence. They should be running. I remember when they made Star Trek 2009, Red Alert, but like one of the ways J.J. Abrams increased the tension of what people typically thought of as boring Star Trek was to have the characters running down the corridors of the Enterprise, because it was like you were suddenly running along with them in like a tense situation. This movie needed people running, not slowly ambling from one station to the next.
And I thought that just on that point, I think that it was a little bit like a fusion cooking recipe that didn't work. Like you were saying, The Birds and North by Northwest. It's just two cuisines that just aren't fusing together in this particular instance. And it's interesting talking about the pacing because, like, I studied this course on ancient Greek tragedy. Clearly, I had nothing better to do with my life at the time. But but even 2,500 years ago, they had this technique. I think it was called stichomythia, where in a play, in a tragedy, the plot would be going along, and then as a way to just like quicken the pace and bring it all alive again and kind of ratchet up the tension, there would be these really short like spats between people where they would just like throw barbs at each other and you would throw one barb, and it just sort of lifted the pace of the movie up, and then eventually it could relax again and go back into it. So I just think that the distance between those bursts were just too long. Like you say, it sort of ambled on for a slow burn, and then we had a set piece, and then it ambled on again, and it just the overall effect was just disjointed, and the pacing I thought was a bit off.
It's weird, Hitchcock said he wanted this to be the sort of antidote to Bond or anything like that. You look at the Ipcress file that came a year before this, that is what I'd say is closer to the antidote for Bond. Not that I'm a big fan of the film, but I acknowledge its place. But, I didn't know the antidote was boredom. That's so strange.
1 year before this, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold.
Yeah.
Which is also very much like kind of the dark side of spycraft.
Great movie.
I think for me, in terms of dislikes, I'm going to save one for Cam, because I think that's what Cam's going to mention. I'm going to go for, I think there was far too much use of bad rear projection and too much use of sets. Now, Hitch is known for not liking on-location shooting. We spoke about that in our Man Who Knew Too Much remake episode. But, yeah, there's some scenes here. I mean, the scene where they're having lunch, where it's basically wall-to-wall rear projection. They couldn't just set a bunch of tables up with some grass in the background. I don't know. I know there's a low budget in this film, but by golly, that it's so blaringly obvious. And the thing is, I'm not saying people were going to Hitchcock films in the 60s for high spectacle. They were going for high drama. But you compare this to films that are coming out in 1966, and you mentioned, it's 1966 is if we're talking about the Matt Helm films, you look at the first two Matt Helm films, they looked better than this film. And this is an Alfred Hitchcock film compared to a Matt Helm, Dean Martin film. Crazy.
Well, I mean, you just look at Thunderball coming out like a year before this. You're on location in the Bahamas. It's beautiful. And here, that scene you're talking about where they're at lunch and the backgrounds are wobbling.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, oh boy, this looks rather creaky. And there was like a funny anecdote I didn't mention in the behind the scenes, but like Hitchcock kind of made overtures of like, I'd like to shoot this movie in East Berlin, but you know what? We couldn't make it happen. And then I believe it was like someone in terms of like the film industry over there was like, no, it could have been done. He just didn't really bother. He wasn't really putting any effort forth. It was like,
Some would argue that's the problem with this film.
Yeah, I mean, Hitchcock liked his controlled environments. And I think even in that lunch, I could argue maybe he's doing that for audio issues. Who knows? But I think it's because he wants control. He wants to be able to focus on Newman and Andrews playing off each other. He wants to position them as he wants them. He does not want to deal with all the crowds around them.
No, that's fair, but there are ways to mitigate those sorts of things. And
there are better for sure.
Yeah, he just wasn't prepared to do those things, and I think it was to the detriment of the film. And the sets, I mean, there were so many random rooms of white wall, paint on the walls of brown tables that I just lost count of all these different sets that sort of merged into one. Now, that could be to do with the decor of East Berlin. I don't know. But it was pretty drab at times. And even when they were like, you look at the bus, for instance, that was just a bus they weren't driving that outside at any point. It was all rear projection. And so it just felt very stuffy. This is not a globe-trotting film, but they do go to quite a few locations. And I'm surprised you don't sort of get to see it a bit more.
Yeah, there is a real drabness to the movie. And I think that's largely intentional, given kind of the subject matter and some of the locations they're going to. And then you have, like, say, like a moment where the Countess shows up and she has that really colorful, like, scarf, which really pops. Because I was, like, making notes like, boy, Hitchcock typically makes very visually dynamic movies that I just want to stare at, whereas a lot of this one looks kind of drab. But then it becomes very obvious that by design he wants that because he wants, like, that, that handkerchief. He wants Julie Andrews in like that red dress. He wants things that really stand out to kind of show kind of the color amidst the drabness. But it does feel like a bit of a slog sometimes when you're just staring at drabness for long, prolonged periods of time.
I will say, though, we got to see more of Copenhagen than we did in The Wrecking Crew, and that was set there.
That is also true, yes.
Yeah. But Cam, I think there's one large elephant left in the room to tackle when it comes to dislikes.
Is there, Scott? Because I was thinking my main dislike was the romance, but we kind of covered that up front. What are you thinking?
Oh, it was the chemistry. I thought you want to dive further into that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that just in terms of, like, the issues of two different acting styles just not merging well. But, like, I think it's interesting you mentioned Eva Marie Saint, who I think has kind of like a carnal quality, and especially in North by Northwest. And you look at that scene that kicks off the movie of Paul Newman and Julie Andrews in bed together. In 1966, that should be, a little spicy. Like, that's not something that Hitchcock would have been able to do in the previous decade. And boy, it is just like actors reciting the phone book together. Like, you have no sense of kind of like the sexiness of this. It just doesn't work. And I think that if that's the way to kick off your movie, we talked about Notorious way back in the day on this show. And you have that prolonged scene of Cary Grant kissing Ingrid Bergman in the hotel room. And it goes on, and you get like this kind of growing passion between them and how into each other they are.
Oh my.
Yeah. Paul Newman and Julie Andrews are as icy together as that ship is without heating.
You've been working on that one, haven't you, sir?
Momentary improvisation. It suddenly popped into my head. I was thinking of that glass of ice and how much it made me laugh.
All right. Okay.
That one was funny.
Yeah.
Well, I think before we wrap it up and look at the knock list real quick, let's just go to any other final notes we've got. Andrew, anything hanging around you want to mention?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I would bring up. One would be just thinking about East Germany and Germany during this time period. So I think that this is quite interesting. The movie comes out in 66. In 1948, we have the Berlin airlift, where the Soviets try to choke off West Berlin. The Allies have an airlift that manages to break that. We get to 1960, the Berlin Wall is built. There's real serious tension between East and West. Kennedy has came in, who's, we speak about Paul Newman being a new generation of actor. He's a new generation of president. He comes in, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's lots of tension, and everybody knows that if World War III is going to happen, it's going to happen in Berlin, or it's going to be probably precipitated by something that's happening in Berlin or Germany. So I think that that's one part of it that's going on then. We look back at the world now and, it looks very different. But imagine being Hitchcock at that time where, East Berlin is there and, West Berlin, and people are worried that there's going to be a nuclear war. And then I think the second thing that I would say would be, I remember I used to hang around with like a different groups of people, but I would hang around with these people that were really into like film studies, that were like really into the aesthetics and the theories behind it and so forth. And then I would also hang around with some people that were film historians. And the two of them approached movies in really different ways. And historians approach movies usually as empirical scolds. You get a rap on the knuckles. This wasn't true, and that wasn't the way that the Stasi would really do it, or the CIA or something. So, I mean, just thinking about it in terms of like what we do here at the museum, looking at the links between popular culture and the real world of intelligence and espionage. So you've got the movie is based on, or it's inspired by the defection of Burgess and McLean in 1952. So Hitchcock is interested in the McLean's wife, Melinda, and then the movie that comes out after this, Topaz, that's precipitated by another spy. I think it's Topaz. That's precipitated by another real life espionage story, the Martel affair, which is basically in France. There's the 1962, just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's like a whole brouhaha involving the United States and France and the Soviet Union, and I won't go into it in depth, but it's quite interesting that this movie and the one that follows it are based on, or not based on, sorry, but they're riffs off of what's really happening in the world of intelligence and espionage. So I think that the 60s are quite an interesting period because of Berlin, because of the Cold War, but also this is an era of spies. This is the same decade that Kim Philby defects to the Soviet Union. And then I think the other thing that's going on here is, if we think about the real world of espionage and intelligence, sending in, physicists or scientists into denied areas, places where it's hard for professional intelligence officers to work, that's not normally what the United States anyway does. If you're trying to get a theorem or an equation from an East German scientist, you're not going to take an across the room good looking guy like Paul Newman, drop him into East Germany, and say, go and figure it out, son. That's just not what normally happens. But that almost doesn't really matter, right? Because Hitchcock's spy movies are generally not about professional agents. It's about the average person that's caught up in this labyrinthine, bewildering world of intelligence and espionage, and they're trying to figure it out, or they're trying to stay alive, or they're trying to go from A to B somehow. So I think that there's just some really interesting things going on, because we're talking about Berlin and Germany, because we're talking about the 60s, and then also because we're talking about the real world of intelligence versus the fictional world of intelligence. And we're talking also about Hitchcock, whose aim is not fidelity to the real world of intelligence and espionage, whose aim is just drama and making movies, and in this particular case, having a box office hit, and for people like us to discuss it many years afterwards.
Yeah, and it's notable to me at one point, Koska, Paul Newman's contact, says, "We're not a political group," which to me kind of sums up Hitchcock's approach to the entire film.
And why would it not be a political group?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
political in the sense that maybe it's not like conservative, maybe it's not like Democrat versus Republican, but I mean, if it's a underground dissident group, it's inherently political, right?
I will say in respect to that group, it did give me a good different title for the film, which was The Pie Who Loved Me.
The pie.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
But the pie thing is quite interesting because this is a secret society, and then this, of course, loops back to the very early days of Hitchcock and the spy genre with 39 Steps, which is like a secret society that's trying to steal British war plans. So I think that this all brings it back full circle because the genre, and you will know more about this than me, but from what I understand, a lot of this comes from the build up to World War One, the big spy scares, and Britain and America. This professionalization of intelligence that comes along. 1909, we have the forerunner of MI5 and MI6 set up. World War One, we have and afterwards we have the professionalization of intelligence. So I think that just Hitchcock's spy movies and this one just map onto a really fascinating period of spy history, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like is I took the mickey at the beginning of this episode for saying we brought on an expert in intelligence and espionage about a film that is completely fictional. But what you've just said is you were the perfect guest.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we did think about this. Maybe we are geniuses. It's hard to say, really. Cam, any notes from you?
Just a couple. The museum set piece with the footsteps I thought was very strong.
I thought that was a matte painting. Until he walked into it. I was like, oh, that's a place.
Yeah, I thought that was a really strong sequence. Also, I just really laughed at Paul Newman's note to Julie Andrews. Gone for a walk. Go home.
That's my outro line sorted.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see a modern day update, maybe just send a WhatsApp message or something, right?
Exactly.
She leaves him on red and you get the one tick. Like it's,
Yeah.
It's a lot of intrigue. Did he read it or not? I don't know. My only notes I had left over was, I think in that sort of title sequence at the start, Hitchcock is quite good at having title sequences. Everyone looks really constipated. Weird looks for everyone as to why they chose those faces, but hey ho, we'll leave that there. But go check it out, folks. And speaking of alternate titles, I did write down a bunch of weird ones. The two that were my favorites were Banged Up Blinds and Distressed Drapes.
Apparently, when Newman and Andrews arrived in their trailers, Hitchcock had torn up the drapes.
Perfect.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
One quick question before you guys close out: is there a MacGuffin in this movie?
I'd say it's the formula.
It's the formula.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. If it's not a good spy film without some sort of MacGuffin or the national anthem being played, or British Parliament. That's basically our tick list. It has to have one of the three. Yeah. Okay, well, knock list time. We have to decide now as the final thing we're going to do here. Now, Cam, as we have a guest, just explain what the knock list is.
Yes, the knock list is our tortured acronym for Need to See Official Classics of the SpyHards podcast, where every week after talking about a movie, we decide if it belongs in the pantheon of all-time great spy films. So today we're going to vote to see if this one joins some other Hitchcock movies like North by Northwest, the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, and The 39 Steps.
Yeah, so it's all to play for. 3 votes. The guest always goes first. Andrew, what do you think? Yes or no? Is Torn Curtain making the knock list?
I like to be optimistic and I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I don't think that you can put this in the same category as those movies you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
This is your vote. Don't let it be influenced by anyone else. If it's a no, it's a no. That's perfectly fine.
It's a no.
It's perfectly fine. There's still 2 votes. We could spoil it for you. You never know. Cam, over to you.
It's a no for me as well. I think there's a reason it's regarded as a lesser or unpopular Hitchcock even. To me, though, it's like if every Hitchcock movie makes the knock list, what's the bar?
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, this man just achieved greatness every single time. I think it's more interesting to have a master filmmaker who you can look at it and say, hey, this movie's got issues. Why? We learn more from his Hitchcock movies that have struggles, I think, than when you look at say, North by Northwest. Like, what do you learn from watching that movie? You go, wow, I don't know how you do that. Whereas this movie, you can go, oh, I understand what the issues are and kind of the pitfalls he fell into trying to make this movie. So for me, it's probably more interesting in some ways to analyze in terms of the mistakes. But yeah, not a knock list movie.
Okay, 2 no's. It's not making a knock list, but here's my vote anyway for those keeping track. If I ever need to go to sleep, I will pop this on.
Cold.
The second watch was a pretty rough one, actually, I have to say. The 2 watch Scott had a lot of trouble with that. But yeah, it's a no from me. It's a great director. This just isn't a great film.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. 3 no's. And as such, Torn Curtain is not making the knock list. The dossier on the film is complete and filed as classified. Andrew, sir, thank you for joining us on the show this week. Before we let you go, I want to hear where people can find you and hear more about you. Now, of course, we'll tackle the 2 things you've got. Of course, you're working at the International Spy Museum. Tell us a little bit about that and where it is and where people can find out more.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. This has been a lot of fun. One day we should just have a marathon and do all 12 of the Hitchcock spy movies just for old time's sake. So I think so the Spy Museum, we're located in Washington, D.C. So perfect location. This is one of the global epicenters of espionage because of the America's position within the world. We have 18 American intelligence agencies as our neighbors, the World Bank, the IMF, obviously the Congress, the White House. So there's lots of spy activity in this city. So we're kind of well placed in that respect. It's very easy to find. We're in this amazing new building down by the river, just off of the mall. So the mall where all of the important buildings are just off of, in Washington, D.C., all of the historic ones as well. So we're here. We are open pretty much every day of the year except Christmas and Thanksgiving. We are always working hard to try to educate, inform, and entertain people about the world of intelligence and espionage. You can do that by coming here, but I know Washington's quite far away for some people. So until then, or until you manage to visit, we have lots of stuff online that you can engage with. So as we mentioned at the beginning, I host the Spy Museum's podcast called SpyCast, which has been around for 17 years now, which is like the Jurassic period of podcasting, right?
Yeah, you were one of the early podcasters. You've got to be in that group, yeah.
Yeah. I think we really are. So we've been around for a long time. We've got just under 600 episodes. We've had on everybody from the former directors of the CIA, like Robert Gates, David Petraeus. We've had on former head of MI5. We've had on people from Indian intelligence agencies, Australian intelligence agencies, Canadian intelligence agencies. We have on scholars, experts, historians, practitioners, former practitioners. Coming up next week, really big deal for us. We have a North Korean defector on the podcast.
Wow.
Now, North Korean defectors are very thin on the ground, and they're very thin on the ground for a whole variety of reasons, one of which is it's kind of dangerous to stick your head above the parapet. So we have a North Korean defector who's going to be on the podcast next week. We've had Russian defectors on. We've just had all manner of interesting guests, really. So if you want to learn, I think it's a perfect complement to you guys' podcast. We tend not to do that much on movies because we can't do everything. So if you're interested in learning more about the world of intelligence and espionage, beside listening to you guys' podcast, SpyCast is out there as well. We have lots of content that I think is pretty unique that you won't find anywhere else. We also have lots of public programs on YouTube. If you go to our YouTube page, we have lots of really interesting stuff. Coming up in the foreseeable future, in October, we're going to have a 5-week special on Israeli intelligence. So we're going to look at that part of the world because we are the International Spy Museum. There's lots going on. There's lots of ways that you can engage with us, and the podcast is probably the easiest way to do it. But if you go to our website, if you can get to Washington DC, there's lots of things going on, and our sole mission is to try to educate and inform people about this, frankly, very, very important topic that's frankly very, very misunderstood.
There's a lot to unpack there. I know, and I can speak on behalf of Cam on this one, that if we ever find ourselves in Washington, D.C., I mean, we are in different countries from America right now, but that's, I think, number one with a bullet on my list of places to go is to visit the museum and hopefully bump into you and get the official, Off the Books tour.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And in terms of, SpyCast, SpyCast and SpyHards with a spy family out there we're doing it in different ways, but we're trying to sort of spread knowledge on these two different sort of subjects that are very well connected there, which is, real life spies and fictional spies. But in terms of people finding you, on social media, where can people find you? And I assume SpyCast is on all sort of major platforms.
SpyCast is on all major platforms. We have a web page. We're part of a small network in the US called the Cyberwire Network. So this is just a place where our podcast lives online. So if you go to the Cyberwire /podcast/SpyCast, you'll find our podcast. It's available, like you say, everywhere: Apple, Spotify, Podchaser, Podbean, basically everywhere. So you can find us anywhere. Please dial in, subscribe, all the usual types of things. If you want to get in contact with me, I'm on Twitter at SpyHistorian, easy to remember. So at SpyHistorian.
It's a good handle.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. Quite a lot of people reach out to me on there. And I'm sure if there's any people that are SpyCast listeners who are also SpyHard listeners, it'd be interesting to hear from you as well. That's me and that's us, and that's what we do.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Well, there'll be links in the show notes below to everything you've mentioned there, and anything else we can find to put in the links as well. To save you all Googling around, you can click the sort of notices below. And I'll be tagging in SpyCast and Andrew, of course, in all of our social media this week as well. So you can obviously find him through those channels as well. But yes, Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
It's been great to speak to you guys. Thanks so much. Thanks for reaching out. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
No, pleasure's all ours. Thanks.
Well, there you go, folks. That was our chat about Alfred Hitchcock's 1966 film, Torn Curtain. But Cam, the question goes to you, sir. What are we looking at next week?
Well, Scott, the Orient Express is back in the news thanks to Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. We're going to catch a ride back to 1948 on that famous train with the kind of comedy spy caper film Sleeping Car to Trieste.
Yeah, we've been talking about trains quite a lot in the year 2023, and I can't wait to punch my ticket once again and head off to Trieste.
That's right, and this movie is easily available to anyone who would like to watch it. It is on YouTube. We will have a link we'll be tweeting out as well for those that would like to catch it before the review comes out. So keep your eyes out. And this is going to be a fun movie, I think, to tackle. I always dig, diving into the obscurities on SpyHards.
Absolutely. So don't sleep on Sleeping Car to Trieste. Your mission, of course, should you choose to accept it, is to join us next week as we tackle that very film. And if you liked what you heard on this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you are listening. And if you do not already, please make sure you follow us discreetly, of course, on social media at SpyHards, that's SpyHards, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, Cam and I are off to look for an American sponsor.